Today we're talking away with TV's Mr. Motorsport, Steve Ryder. Hello there, Greg Haynes with you. And when it comes to motor racing on the television in the United Kingdom, or indeed any sport on television in the United Kingdom, there's pretty much nothing that Steve Ryder has not covered at least once across his glittering TV career. But it wouldn't be right for me to begin the show today without a little bit of nostalgia. Here's what I remember of Steve Ryder. And then it would be cue Steve. Sorry, Steve, I had to start with that. I could not throw that in.
Oh, you have no idea the fear that strikes into me, even 20 years down the line, because you get halfway through that music and you think, oh, we've got 5.5 hours ahead of us, and we've only really prepared the first 45 seconds of the program. So every weekend it was a sort of jump into the unknown, but my goodness, it was a great program to work on. And you earned your corn on some afternoons when things didn't go entirely to plan, but I was lucky enough to follow in the footsteps of the great Des Lynam and learned so much from sitting alongside him and watching him work, and also getting involved in that program. Great days, and thanks for reminding us of that theme music, which, as I say, does strike fear into the heart.
Yeah, we might have to play that in again at the end, I think. It's just such nostalgia, isn't it? And those were the days. I mean, it reminds me of my granddad's, watching sport on the TV, Steve, and, my mum's side of the family, very, very sport-oriented. But it made celebrities of sports people that, without Grandstand, we perhaps might not know of. And I guess it was the same with World of Sport on ITV as well.
Yeah, and I started with World of Sport. I did World of Sport probably only about a dozen editions from 1980 through to joining the BBC in 1985. And that was a different kind of program. They didn't have the contracts that the BBC had, so they had to be a little bit more inventive and a little bit more light-hearted. So you would sit there with Saint and Greavesy on the other side of the studio throwing bread rolls at you, and you'd end the afternoon with all-in wrestling and so on. And then, but the BBC was slightly different, and if you were serious about being involved in sports outside broadcasting, then there was only one place to be, and that was the BBC, and that was Grandstand.
I'll have to ask. I think we'll have to do a second podcast, won't we, to discuss everything. Maybe we'll stick to the motor racing today. Yeah. Thank you very much. That would be a pleasure. But where did it start? What was the first contact Steve Ryder had with an engine of some kind? Was it a bike? Was it a car? Was it something you'd always been interested in? How did it happen?
No, it all happened by accident. Even to this day, half an hour ago, I've been trying to fit a battery into my old Fiat 500, and I can't do it. I can't.
You sound like Barry Nutley.
I'm not like those wheeler dealer guys or anything like that. So I've got no acumen with or ability around the technology of motoring or motorsport at all. I started off as a local journalist, and I was in southeast London covering football in the summer, football in the winter, cricket in the summer, Crystal Palace, Millwall and Charlton and all those. And then got the opportunity. I went via London Broadcasting when that first started, and then eventually went to Anglia Television as the second member of their sports department. And it was there that you realized exactly what motorsport was all about in terms of its variety, and also in terms of the way that if you had a television crew in tow, the way that you could gain access and relate to it in a way that was beyond the normal spectator. So I went up to Anglia and immediately discovered filming at places like Snetterton, and Silverstone was also part of our area. And also just down the road from Norwich, and this was 1977, you had Lotus. And Lotus were on the verge of winning the World Championship for Mario Andretti. And so part of our regular filming commitments was at Ketteringham Hall with Team Lotus to get the latest, and as a result formed a decent friendship with Colin Chapman, and was given access to a lot of what they were doing. And ended up on the pit wall. I mean, a year after I got involved in motor racing, I'm standing on the pit wall at Monza alongside Colin Chapman for the Italian Grand Prix. But and to get the opportunity for those sort of experiences, it was always going to be an enthusiasm that would stay with you.
And that was a very tragic weekend, wasn't it? Despite Mario winning the championship because of the loss of Ronnie Peterson. I mean, what a way to start, Steve.
Well, it was, but it's a strange thing because the team were obviously set for the World Championship that weekend. So the regional program and with Team Lotus's cooperation said, well, why don't you come over and spend the weekend with the team? And we'll do a nice little thing for the About Anglia regional program when you get back on how the team works, the World Championship team, and how the catering works, and all the local people that are on the team and so on. And so we did that, and we were made very welcome, and we went filming with them, behind the scenes at Monza for Friday, Saturday. We had Saturday evening at the Villa d'Este with Andretti and Ronnie Peterson and Colin Chapman and so on. And then the next day, the race, when race day didn't go to plan, Ronnie crashed in the morning, and we did a lot of filming around the aftermath of that because his car couldn't be repaired for the race, so he had to go into the spare car, which was set up for Mario. And then race disappears into the distance, and there's a huge cloud of smoke down at the first corner, and we came away thinking it was one of those things. He had a badly broken leg, off to hospital, and things were going to be fine. And it was the days before, fast-moving news and so on. And it wasn't until we got back to Liverpool Street Station and on the way back to Norwich on the Monday that we saw the placards, Ronnie Peterson has died. And which is wow. And I remember doing a piece for Sky F1 many years later with Mario. And Mario said he was on his way to visit Ronnie in hospital on the Monday morning. And the guy at the toll booth on the Autostrada said, "I'm very sorry about your mate, just heard he's died." And, that's how news travelled in those times. But it was quite an experience. And of course, the regional program said, well, we can't really screen a jolly profile of the team. So we sat there for 4 or 5 months with all that material. And then an editor at Anglia who shared my enthusiasm said, well, why don't we try and put a half-hour documentary together from just about everything that we'd filmed at that weekend? And we did that. And it went out. It's still around. It's called 3 Days at Monza. And it's the first Formula One documentary that I ever worked on, and so on, in 1978. But that's what got me going, really. But it was a very bittersweet experience, to be sure.
Well, there's been so many things over the years, haven't there, Steve? Good and bad. And it just seems like with our sport as well, it does deliver the highest highs and sometimes the very lowest of lows as well. But let's start with one of the highs. This is a race I clearly remember as though it was yesterday. Brazil 2008, the last ITV Grand Prix as well, of course. And that was a shock, wasn't it? We'll maybe talk about that in a moment, about how you heard you'd lost the rights there, which happened earlier than expected, didn't it? With the Beeb taking it back again. But this is the end of 2008. And it was all down to the wire.
Massa versus Hamilton, the World Championship decider. Interlagos expects, and to be honest, Brazil is starting to believe. But Britain holds its breath. Could the World Championship be snatched away from Lewis Hamilton once again? It's the Brazilian Grand Prix. It's the race that decides everything.
So he's got grip. Hamilton's lost it. Oh my goodness me! Vettel's taken the place, and that could cost Hamilton the World Championship.
Oh, it's
now raining hard, and that means Glock is going to be in trouble. He's in 4th place, and with just 2 laps to go, the question now is, can Timo Glock in the Toyota keep it on the island? If he cannot, then Hamilton might have a chance of getting the title back. At the moment, 6th will not do it for him.
Can you believe it? Right now, it's all down to whether Glock can handle the rain. And let's look at Glock's sector times. They're fine. Sector 1 is fine. Hamilton is not going to get the championship right now. If it doesn't rain harder, it's all about Glock now. Or can he get back at Vettel?
It's all about these last few corners now. We're expecting Massa any time now. He comes through to claim his 6th victory of the season. He has done everything he needed to do, and we wait now to find out who will be the world champion of 2008. Can Hamilton do anything? Can he run it up the inside of Vettel? Only a few corners to go now, and desperation starts to creep in for Lewis Hamilton.
Raikkonen's 3rd, and is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly?
It is, it's Glock. Oh my goodness me, Hamilton's back in position again. 100,000 local hearts sink in the grandstands. It's handed the place back to Hamilton. He comes through, and if I'm absolutely right, I'm sure that he is going to claim 5th place, which is all he needs to do to become the 2008 Formula One World Champion, Lewis Hamilton. And you will, well, the Ferrari boys are celebrating.
They both think they've won, but Ferrari are wrong.
They're absolutely wrong. Hamilton's finished 5th, and Lewis, the father, has just realised that he celebrated a little bit too early. And Nicole Scherzinger, the girlfriend of Lewis Hamilton, hugs Aki Hintsa, his head doctor. You will never see a more dramatic conclusion to any motor race, let alone a Grand Prix, than that. And the result of it all is that in the most harem-scarum way possible, he doesn't make it easy for himself, does he? Lewis Hamilton is the world champion.
Unbelievable.
And our particular thanks go to James Allen and also to Martin Brundle. It's lump in the throat time for everyone who's been involved in this extraordinary sporting drama that's developed over the course of the last half hour. The emotions that Lewis Hamilton feels, that Ron Dennis feels, that Felipe Massa must feel up on that victory podium, trying to celebrate victory and absorb the agony of a title slipping away. Mark Blundell, have you seen anything quite like this?
I've never seen anything like it, Steve. It's an incredible situation, an incredible last lap, and a last lap what made a Grand Prix very special, but it also made a World Championship for Lewis Hamilton in very, very strange surroundings.
Well, we'll continue to get whatever reaction we can. We'll try to invade whatever celebrations we can. We're getting soaked down here in the pit lane. We don't mind. We'll be back here at Interlagos in just a couple of minutes.
And Steve, you can hear the samba drums going in the background there. Pure sporting drama. It still sends a tingle down your spine listening to it now, doesn't it?
Well, it does, because the context of it was so extraordinary. A similar thing had happened at the same location to Lewis a year before without having the right result. But here we were, from an ITV point of view. ITV had taken over the contract in, 97? So they were about 11, 12 years of flogging around Formula One. They had to, and I say it with respect, endure the Michael Schumacher domination and a period in which Formula One was, fairly flat in terms of British success or British excitement. And there we were this was the last Grand Prix that ITV would be covering. And there we were on the last corner of the last Grand Prix of the last season of ITV's involvement in Formula One. They'd never had a world champion until that moment with Timo Glock. And I remember I was standing, and it was raining pretty hard. So Mark Blundell and myself had taken shelter, ironically, in the canopy that is just alongside where the Ferrari computer base was. And we were obviously following that wonderful commentary of James Allen, and all respect to him, the way James and Martin Brundle read that race and, read the potential scenario. And they were jumping up and down in Ferrari and sort of ignoring the coverage. They'd assumed the title was theirs. And Mark just he just tapped on the window and sort of said, fellas, and sort of imparted the message that the World Championship had slipped away. But, oh, my goodness. I mean, an extraordinary half hour and the climax to an extraordinary season.
And I've watched that back with commentary in the BBC radio commentary, Steve, and various other languages around the world. And as far as I can find, ITV with James and Martin were the only commentators who actually noticed Hamilton passing Glock while it happened, and not only when he came over the line and finished fifth.
Yeah, and also flagged it up with a lap to go. Watch Glock, watch Hamilton. It's the relationship between those two that's going to decide. It's going to decide the championship. And I mean, it was the coverage won a BAFTA, which I don't think was particularly deserved from the point of view of the production, but it was certainly deserved from the point of view of the way our two commentators handled those last two laps.
It's interesting because I remember reading your book, My Checkered Career, which came out 2012, I believe. I remember you said that about the BAFTA, and you said the whole system just seems a bit of a joke sometimes. Why did you not feel the coverage deserved it?
Well, we came off too early. I mean, we were now in. I don't know, I suppose it was about 7:15 on a Sunday evening. And there was no overrun or anything. There was no one within ITV to make a decision. These are exceptional circumstances and we need to be there to really sort of milk all the reaction and so on. No, we were bang off the air with about, 2 minutes after the podium, which, is an understandable commercial decision, but it wasn't a BAFTA winning moment. I mean, the point I was making about BAFTAs, and I say this with all humility, that I've been lucky enough to be involved in productions that have won 5, and on each one you sort of go back on the production and you think, God, that was awful, what we did there. But on each occasion, the BAFTA was awarded for the quality of the sporting event rather than the quality of the coverage. Yeah. So we won a BAFTA, I remember, with the BBC for Redgrave winning in Sydney and for Matthew Pinsent winning the rowing in Athens. And then we won a BAFTA for Jenson Button's victory, his first race win. We got a BAFTA for Lewis winning in Indianapolis, and we got a BAFTA for the Brazilian Grand Prix. The productions that really deserve BAFTAs are the productions that you manage to put around really boring sporting events and bring the best out of them. But great events like those, that you can't put a foot wrong. But I'm not sure whether they're really award winning.
Do you like it when things go wrong, Steve? Because when we're commentating with Eurosport and we get a red flag, and behind the scenes it's chaos, isn't it? And I have to say, I love those moments because I feel that's when we really earn our money. What's it like for you in Prez? Is it the same?
Yeah, from a television point of view, I think the programs that I've worked on, Grandstand was always seat of the pants live, make it up as you go along, no autocue or anything like that. You just go with the flow of the events as they develop. And you assume that a program like that is going to hit the buffers on occasions, and always have in mind what you're going to say if it does. So if a race is suddenly halted after a lap and a half or something like that, and you've got to have in mind exactly how you're going to react to that moment. And it comes from, I suppose, years of working at Augusta, where working on the BBC coverage, we'd be taking the feed from CBS in America, and you would get probably, if you're lucky, you will get 7 seconds notice that they were going to go to a commercial break. Wow. So you get 7 seconds notice that you're going to be filling for 3 minutes immediately. And that sort of prepared you professionally and in every other way for making sure that you're absolutely ready to cope with that situation. And that spills over into everything else. You never we're on the air for 8 hours with a touring car championship, and you never sit back in your chair and think, right, we're okay for the next 45 minutes, because in motorsport that it never works out like that. And we had an incident at Thruxton last year in one of the support races that caused a delay of an hour and a half. Yeah. And we had nothing on the truck that we were able to fill with. So, Paul O'Neill especially was terrific that day. And we talked and we got interviews in, and made it up as we went along and so on. But strangely, the one program that really made you nervous was Sports Personality of the Year, because that show was prepared, scripted, rehearsed again. So you knew that the only thing that could possibly go wrong is the presenter, and so you felt more pressure on that occasion with a program that had been honed to perfection than a program like Grandstand that could go in any one of 100 directions at a moment's notice. So it's a funny old business, but you do feel when it goes wrong and you go wrong as well, you don't get the same sort of satisfaction. But if it goes wrong and you handle it right, then it is a nice feeling.
And it's a very different kettle of fish, isn't it? I guess something like Sports Personality of the Year, because you're actually talking to an audience, a crowd at the event, as well as just talking to one person, as it were, if you're addressing a camera. But is it true that Des Lynam, who was obviously very smooth and suave, used to be extremely nervous until you went on air, and then all the nerves would go to you and Sue Barker or whoever else was presenting it with you that year?
Oh, Des was a nightmare. Des was, had this, wonderful profile of, in control and, Mr. Smooth and all that. So for half an hour before we went on air with Sports Personality, he was almost inconsolable. This is going to go wrong. That's going to wrong. Oh, it's going to be awful. Wow. We had a bottle of brandy behind, and we gave him a stiff brandy before each show, and he would, it's. And then, the three of us would walk out, and Sue and I would be in pieces, and, Des would be, hello. And, off he'd go, and you think, you bugger.
Yeah. Amazing.
Great broadcaster, though, Des. Great broadcaster.
Well, we were talking of things you can't script, Steve, and this was certainly one memorable moment for you, I suppose, for all the wrong reasons. And, of course, it's Sunday, the 1st of May, 1994.
Good evening. If you've tuned in tonight expecting the outstanding race that the San Marino Grand Prix here at Imola promised to be, then I'm sorry, that's not the programme we have for you. Instead, the sport of Formula One tonight is in deep mourning. Yesterday we had the loss of Roland Ratzenberger, the first Formula One racing fatality for 12 years. And today we've lost, arguably, the greatest talent of his generation. After a high-speed crash at Tamburello, Ayrton Senna is dead.
What do you remember of the day, Steve? It must be absolutely etched in the forefront of your mind, I would imagine. But that's the sort of thing that just you would think could not happen and should not happen live in Vision in 1994 to a world audience. What do you remember of the day?
Well, it's, I don't want to sort of go on for that, but it was the weekend, really, that you remember, because the BBC in those days used to get their money's worth out of their presenters. So the previous day, I was at Wembley doing the Rugby League Challenge Cup final, and then we'd get a plane out and join the crew out in Italy on late on Saturday night. And we were sitting there in the studio at Wembley, only about 10 o'clock in the morning, and the phone rang to the floor manager, and it was Simtech Racing, and they said, is Steve going out to Imola, because we've got something like a suspension part that we need him to hand carry out, and that's the only way we can get it out there. So they delivered this thing to Wembley Stadium, and it was wrapped up in brown paper, and it was leaning against the back of the studio wall when we came on air and had to give the news about Roland Ratzenberger. Roland Ratzenberger, a Simtech driver, killed that morning at Imola, and you immediately thought, this is a bit weird, but it got out to Imola and delivered the package to Simtech, and with all the sympathies and everything that was surrounding the gloom that morning. And on we went, but there was always a feeling of there'd been a fatality at the circuit that weekend, so it was a strange atmosphere. Jonathan Palmer and I put the program on the air with Ayrton Senna in his car behind us, and he was under huge pressure from Michael Schumacher at the time, and that was the talking point of the race. And then, there was a huge start line crash for a start, which brought out the safety car. And then after a couple of laps behind the safety car, the fateful restart and the crash that we're also familiar with. But Italian television rather dwelt on it with the helicopter hovering overhead. But we were fortunate. It was one of those rare occasions that we decided to link from a circuit. So we had an extra camera there, which was my presentation camera. So we were able to cut away from the pictures and fill in other ways on the pit wall and try not to speculate too much about what the outcome may be, but everyone felt exactly the same. And we had to progress with the program, and the faces in the pit lane told their own story. I saw people like Annie Bradshaw come past and Martin Whitaker, and you just knew from the expressions that they gave you that it was the worst outcome. But we weren't allowed to give any information, or we're not allowed, that the race meeting went ahead without any announcement of Ayrton's death, and that's the Italian way of doing it, and that's the Formula One Bernie Ecclestone way of doing it. Look, let's not create huge problems by abandoning the meeting. Let's go ahead. And Ayrton had been taken to hospital, and I remember we were standing on the pit wall when required. We were linking around frames of the World Snooker Championship, which was our other event that day. And then at the end of the program, we had to give the awful news, and everything else was abandoned. It was we had the normal thing would be to record links for the Grand Prix program a bit later, but they decided to bring Grand Prix ahead and make it a live program. Before that, we had to go into all the 6 o'clock news bulletins and everything, and give updates from the circuit, and then did Grand Prix live with Murray, and it was about 10 o'clock when we left the circuit, and we drove back, and we were staying at Ravenna, which was about a 40-minute drive away, and we sat in the hire car, and nobody said a word, and then after about half an hour, Murray suddenly said, was it lap 14 or 15 that a Lacey came in for tyres? And we all looked, and again, Murray was his thoughts very professionally were going on to the Murray diary that he had to do, that he was contracted to do, and it sort of burst the balloon, and everyone, there were a few tears, and everyone just thought, we'll head for the nearest bar when we get to Ravenna, and we had a night to remember. I remember they had racing, on these sort of slot racing machines at the back, and Jonathan Palmer was giving it plenty and everything. And it was the kind of, letting off of pressure that was absolutely necessary, because my goodness, we all felt it. And it was the most dreadful day. But hopefully, we can look back and feel that we handled it right, because it was a tough one, because I got to know Ayrton, reasonably well from Anglia days. I knew him when he was, and we filmed with him when he was racing Formula Ford at Snetterton and so on. And tough one, but so much as mystique has surrounded that weekend, and I can understand how, because we could feel it immediately. And I remember going back there, we did a documentary. Instead of doing a review of the year, we did a documentary about Ayrton, and we went back to Imola in about November, and it was a grey, rainy day, and we walked out to Tamburello just to do some shots and to maybe do a piece to camera and so on. And it was misty, the mist in the trees, and we looked into the trees, and there must have been, I would have thought, 100, 200 people just standing there quietly.
Really? Wow.
Most of them women, flowers on the fence still, and nobody saying a word, just quiet. And we thought, wow. And it was an astonishingly moving experience, because this was 6 months after the race, and you just realized at that moment, the impact in the wider world that his death had brought. But tough one, long time ago now, but it's still a bit raw, that's for sure.
I remember, Steve, I walked the circuit when I first went to Imola with the Superbikes in 2015, and it was a little bit like you just described it. It was a spring day, though, but it was the evening, and it had that mystical feel about it when you walk around the circuit and how narrow it is, and there's people's houses and gardens literally just over the other side of the barriers in some places. And even now, it still has that mystical feel about it, doesn't it? It's a special place.
It is. I was lucky enough a few years later to do that series for Sky F1, the F1 Legends, and we had a day with Gerhard Berger, and he told the story about how a year earlier he'd walked, he had his enormous crash at Tamburello as well, and he and Ayrton had walked out to Tamburello and looked at the corner because they were, very nervous about the runoff area and the limited scope there was to have a big accident there. And they looked over the wall and realized that there was a river over the wall, and so the circuit couldn't be pushed back any further. And Gerhard said they just both shrugged their shoulders and said, well, that's the way it is. And but it was, another sort of weird insight that Ayrton had actually sort of had misgivings about that corner, along with a lot of other drivers, way ahead of that accident.
Well, not too long after that, of course, the BBC lost the rights, didn't they, to Formula One at the end of 1996. So the programme started with the chain for the very last time, and it was an early morning start too.
Damon Hill once said he used to listen to that music with the volume turned up and dream of being a world champion. Now, as that theme introduces live Formula One on BBC television for possibly the last time, his dream is almost complete. But the next couple of hours might just be a little bit nerve-wracking. Jacques Villeneuve needs race victory at the very least. Damon Hill needs just one more championship point to make absolutely certain of that world title. Now, you're up early, so let's take you straight there. There's Villeneuve on pole position, the championship rivals sharing the front row for this decisive Japanese Grand Prix. And the start less than 15 minutes away. We'll join Tony Jardine, Jonathan Palmer and Murray Walker.
Well, Murray Walker seems to have been hearing that music all his life. It's good day to Britain, Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and I'm sure a whole lot more from sunny Suzuka.
So nice just to hear the dulcet tones of Murray there, Steve. Just even then in a non-exciting...
Where do you find this?
Oh, there's a big archive here. There's plenty more to play in future shows. There's a big back. This just shows you how sad I am, doesn't it? How much of my life I spent watching this stuff. But of course, that was the day that he had a lump in his throat. And again, a bit like with Hamilton in 2008, a British champion at the end of the BBC's Grand Prix coverage, as it was at the time as well.
Strange, isn't it? Yeah, it was. It was a tough moment because it came at a time. Well, I think the BBC was just beginning to face reality that there were other broadcasters out there who were quite keen to get their hands on the crown jewels of BBC Sports content. But that was a big shock. I think maybe a year or so earlier, I think Channel 4 had successfully made a bid for Test cricket. And that was a wake-up moment for the BBC that, they had no divine right to hang on to these events, and they had no deep pockets like other broadcasters had to pay, as ITV did back in 96, 97, 4 times the amount that the BBC was paying. So the writing was on the wall for BBC content from that moment on, not just Formula One, but everything else that was possibly going to slip through their fingers. But it was a shock, and I got permission. I was approached by my old friends at Anglia, where I'd started off doing motorsport. They got hold of me and they said, we really fancy bidding for the production contract for Formula One. Do you fancy joining a consortium or at least a group to chat about it? And I got permission from Jonathan Martin to get involved there. And we sat down, we had a couple of meetings at pubs in Norwich. We brought a young chap who had broadcasting ambitions named Martin Brundle to the group, and just sort of fleshed out what we thought might be the best sort of production plan for ITV's coverage of Formula One. And we were later joined by elements from Meridian and a larger group from Chrysalis, and we formed a bid. And to my horror, we won it. And we sort of begged the question about what I was going to do. And but in the end, I decided to stay with the BBC, and I'm glad I did, because the next 10 years with the BBC were particularly enjoyable. But it was a big hole for a few years. No involvement in Formula One, and I was more than happy when the opportunity arose in 2005 to come back with ITV.
Yes, and of course you took over at the time for the start of the 2006 season from Jim Rosenthal, who, like Jake Humphrey from 2009 through to 12, Steve, wasn't the most massive Formula One fan, but never pretended he wasn't either, did he, Jim? Came in and sort of with that sort of let's learn this together as we go along, and I suppose that worked very well considering the coverage was also new. Commercial breaks, of course, was one of the negatives, but ITV's output did take things to another level, didn't it, at the time?
Well, it did, and you look back at what the BBC did, and you think, people say, the golden years of Grandstand and the golden years of Grand Prix coverage. Well, it wasn't. We go back, and even when I joined in 85, 86, maybe in through the late 80s when we were covering Formula One, I'd come on with Sunday Grandstand. And there'd be a kind of macho thing. Let's say you're doing the Belgian Grand Prix, to try to hand over to Murray, as late as possible at the end of the formation lap, to make it all seem sort of slick and joined up. And it gave the poor old fella no time to set the scene or anything like that. And then we did, you do 15 laps of coverage, and then cut away to Sunday cricket for a couple of hours. And rejoin the race at 4:00, and there was no outraged public reaction. But if you did that now,
yeah.
I mean, there'd be questions in Parliament. But it was, that was what the BBC were all about. ITV really shook things up, and I would say that ITV played a bigger role in the formation of Formula One coverage these days than the BBC ever did, because they took it to trackside, they took it behind the scenes, they threw technology at it and so on. Yeah, there was the commercial break thing, but by a wing and a prayer, there were only a couple of occasions where they were really intrusive. It was never ideal, but they got away with it a little bit. But from that day on, nobody else would dare cover Formula One with any less commitment than ITV did from 97 onwards.
Now, what that did mean, of course, is that from 97 onwards, the BBC did extend its coverage for the British Touring Car Championship, and a 30-minute highlight programme went up to an hour-long highlight programme, all on Grandstand, of course. Live race coverage started from 97 onwards as well. But let's just sit back, Steve, for 3 minutes and appreciate some of the classic Murray Walker BHP-produced touring car moments. For my money, some of the best race commentary we have ever heard. Let's just enjoy this. Murray Walker and the super touring days of the British Touring Car Championship.
And it's go for 1997. A fabulous start by Alan Menu, second on the grid, and he's passed Jason Plato already. Down the avenue, chasing Rob Gravitt at 130 miles an hour. He's going through. Oh, thump again. He's hit it twice. But he's passed, and he's hit Menu, and now he's hit Hoy. And the two Renaults hit each other. Both off, both out. Here they come. Ready seats. Number one, Winkelhock, second in the BMW. Third is Alan Menu in the Renault. Behind him is Steve Soper, out of Dufferston. Peter McIntyre's the right-hander. This is really close. Through the chicane. And off. It's Tarquini. What happened? But John Cleland is attacking Soper. He's up on two wheels. Soper holds his line. He's pushed right out to the right. He attacks again as they go to the right-hander and Lovehill. And they both spin. They're both out. Soper and Cleland both out of the race. Now, we're with John Cleland. What's happening? Where is Derek Warwick? He's around there somewhere in the vector. There he is, and he's off. He's off. John Cleland seems to have nerfed his own teammate off. There's Jamie Wall. He's alongside Matt Neal. The Nissan of Leslie's behind him. Wall hits It's Neil. Neil stays ahead. Wall hits him again. Neil spins. Wall tries to go around the outside. He drifts wide. And my goodness, man, Neil stayed ahead. And Rabbit is going to take them both right on the apex, and they hit each other. Does it? Oh, my goodness. A full 360-degree spin. The wheel is off. The grass has caught fire. Rydell pulling out to pass. Look out! That is a colossal accident. 130 miles an hour. Brady Siege hit somebody, didn't see who it was. The rest of them are on their way, but they're going to have to stop the race just as they did before. And Ravalia leads, and Winkelhock is going for it, and Winkelhock goes ahead, pulls out, goes ahead of his teammate, and goes off. Oh, we're with Winkelhock. Menu is coming up on the left. Leslie's got through as well as they turn into Paddock, the right-hander, climb up Hailwood Hill, and Menu off. Ravalia off. The two leaders off. There's Menu stuck at the bottom of the hill, and that's Harvey going off. My goodness, there's carnage there. It's a multiple collision. Back at Stirling's, Richard Kay, the leading privateer, is catching Robertson's Ford. What's his Peugeot? Robertson has a go. Kay is rocketing up on both of them. He's going to take Robertson on the outside as they come out of Clearways. No, it's going to be the inside. He hits him. And Robertson spins. Bang, bang, front rear into the wall. And he's almost at the line. Is he going to get over it? Yes, there's the checkered flag. Robertson just finishes, but I think there'll be a steward's inquiry about that.
Now, I defy anyone to listen to that without a smile on their face, Steve. Of course, none of those were actually commentated on live, were they? Those particular clips there were all pre-recorded highlights, mixed-mashed together. But Murray did an incredible job to make it sound live, didn't he?
Yeah, and that was all just one race, what you heard. There was always incident-packed. Yeah, I mean, we were shooting on single cameras and then doing the edit over the next 2 or 3 days. And Murray would dub the commentary and he was very open about that. But it really it gave, such dynamism to the coverage as you were hearing there. But he would come in on a Wednesday afternoon. VHP was in Gough Square in the centre of London. And he would look through the edit as it was, and then we'd check him into a very nice hotel down the road, and then he'd come back and work on the script during the course of the next day, and then he'd be ready at about 4:00 in the afternoon, and we all had to sit in the dubbing suite and listen to his performance, because that's what it was, a performance as much as a commentary. And then when he'd finished, we all had to sit there in the viewing theatre, with Murray and sort of give our assessment and so on. And it was an eccentric experience in many ways, but we loved the guy. And I've worked many times as well with Murray in a live situation, and my goodness, what he brings to that is extraordinary. But equally, he was able to if I can use the expression, ham it up when it was needed as well. And, when you're doing a sort of slam bang 20-minute highlights of a race, it is exactly what you need. We sort of locked horns a little bit, a few years later, because I said, at some stage, Murray, we've got to start going live with the British Touring Car Championship. Everyone knows that it's, it is sort of twisted reality in terms of what actually happens in a race. And he said, well, you can never do that. But it will probably be beyond even his sort of commentary acrobatics to be able to master it. But also people would understand that the races aren't quite like what they see on television. And I said, well, we've got to confront that at some stage. And he actually wrote in his book about how we were at loggerheads.
Yeah,
about,
he did. He said it was the only thing Steve Ryder and I ever disagreed on, he said, didn't he?
Yeah, well, to an extent he was right, because there was a sort of dip as the BBC tried to, assess that commitment. And then ITV came along and took up the reins. And I think, even Murray, bless him, I saw him in the few years before he died, and he would always turn up at the Thruxton meeting and always say, I was wrong, this is fantastic, and so on. But great experience working with him.
Yeah, it was so sad. I never met Murray, although I feel like I did, Steve, but it was so sad to hear he'd gone. And, 97, he was so close to 100, wasn't he? And it all happened in the middle of the pandemic as well. It was just over a couple of years ago, wasn't it? March 2021. What was he like as a man, though? Not just a performer, a commentator, but as a gentleman?
He was absolutely one of the best. He was caring about young drivers. His great joy, even in his later years at Thruxton, when he would come along, was just walking around the paddock, and particularly around the junior category. The young Ginetta drivers or the drivers in Clios, and he just wanted to hear all their stories and so on. And he was absolutely involved, but it was a motorsport man through and through. And interestingly enough, when he died, we're running a little research operation, trying to locate a lot of the lost coverage of pre-1980 Formula One in particular. And a couple of programs came on to us, and they said, well, what have you got of Murray? And I knew that Murray had at home, because he played it to me, a very sort of scratchy 20-second cassette recording of his very first commentary, 1949 British Grand Prix for BBC Radio. So he went back to the BBC and said, there must be a longer version of this. And they said, well, no, a lot of people have asked for that, but no, not in our files. It's obviously got wiped, and that's all that exists, and that's all that Murray ever heard of his first commentary. So we got a guy working with us who's a brilliant researcher, Richard Wiseman, and he said, well, it must exist somewhere. So he went back through all the old editions of Radio Times and found the announcement of the broadcast from Silverstone in 1949 was International Motor Racing from Silverstone. And everyone else had been looking for British Grand Prix from Silverstone. So we went back into the sound archives, International Motor Racing from Silverstone. And there it was, probably 10 minutes of the climax of the race. Murray Walker out in the country, Max Robertson on the start-finish line. Absolutely wonderful stuff. And we took it back to the BBC because it was centenary year, and we said, look what we found. And there was a sort of so what attitude, where can we use that? And it's, I've still got it, and we play it at motor clubs and things like that, and we might find another home for it and so on. But it's just a shame that Murray never got to hear it, because it is so distinctively Murray. I'll pass it on to you as well, and you can defy the BBC and stick it on a podcast or something like that.
It's funny you say that, Steve, because I was looking at some stuff on YouTube the other day, and while you've been talking, I've just been looking at this because I saved this, and it's only a 48-second clip.
De Graffenried is now taking Stowe Corner for the last time this afternoon. He bounces a bit as he goes round with his yellow wheels spinning, and he's motoring as he goes down to the chicane. He looks back to see if there's any opposition. He's going up to the hairpin bend, taking no chances this time, and is now heading up the straight to the Abbey curve, and I think in about 3 seconds max he'll be into your sight to take over the finishing line, because he's just crossing in front of the hangar now.
Can't see him. Is he going to come in a moment? He'll be here. Yes, he's here, flashing into sight. But is this the last lap? Yes, it is. I think it is the last lap. Up goes the checkered flag, and he's the winner. Well done to Graffenried. Listen to him go by.
That is the 100th.
What seems so sad, Steve, I didn't realise that Murray hadn't heard that, because I've heard him chatting in interviews over the year saying, it wasn't recorded back then. And so it did exist all that time then, and he didn't realise what a shame.
It did exist. It was just catalogued wrong. Richard Wiseman was the one who tracked it down. And, I'm glad it's sort of, everything sneaks out on YouTube.
I'm trying to remember. It's funny how you described that was found, because I'm trying to remember where I found that. It was only about a month or so ago.
I think we sent a copy to the National Motor Museum.
Right.
And we played it at motor clubs and things like that. So these things are going to find.
Okay, so somebody stuck it on YouTube.
Yeah, because it's a bit of broadcasting history, and good memories of Murray.
So,
good man.
1949, De Graaf and Reed winning there. So BHP, Steve, and the whole coverage there for Grandstand, how did that start? Because the Touring Car Championship at that time was a very complicated four-class system, wasn't it, in which anyone could come out as the overall champion. We saw John Cleland winning in 89, although he was in one of the lower classes. So these Sierra Cosworths were, spitting flames out of the exhaust and winning the races with Rob Gravitt and Andy Rouse and people like that. But they weren't actually winning most of the overall titles, were they? Which was quite confusing.
Yeah, it was very complicated for a few years, but what was even more complicated was the way we put the coverage together, because it wasn't BBC coverage. The very first edition of Grandstand that I presented, which was in July 1985, I remember the first insert that I presented was round 6 of the MG Metro Challenge or something like that. So I said to the editor, what's the championship position? For my first link, I need, you need to put it in context and so on. We don't give a stuff about that. It's just round 6 of the MG Metro Challenge, and it was just a race, and it was sort of cast off into the ether with no explanation as to the relevance. And so we got thinking that the BBC at that time had contracts with all the circuits, and they were required, and the contract said, right, we visit Thruxton twice a year, we visit Donington once a year, or Oulton Park once a year. Doesn't matter what was on there. They would just go and, film it and fulfill the commitment. So when those contracts came to a close, there was an opportunity to say, right, well, why don't you concentrate on championships rather than circuits, so you can tell the full narrative of a championship story. And the BBC said, well, we can't afford to do that, because it would mean, wheeling the outside broadcast unit out, 20, 30 times a year. But if the championships themselves were able to finance the coverage, we would find a slot on Grandstand to accommodate that. So we sat down, we had a meeting with the editor of Grandstand, John Phillips, and Tiff Niddell, Murray Walker and myself, to work out how this could and should be done. And we decided that the 2 championships to concentrate on will be the British Touring Car Championship and Formula 3. And cut a long story short, we went to the component parts of the championships, the entrance and the rights holders, and said, if you can stump up, I think it was about £12,000 a round, we can guarantee, a high profile on Grandstand. And it got a bit murky at times, and there were a few things that went on. You won't be astonished to believe that the BBC guidelines back then in the mid 80s were even more opaque than they are now. So there was a lot going on. But in the end, we managed to establish a profile on Grandstand. We managed to, get through the class system, which complicated things for a couple of years. And slowly, the championships realised that not only were they generating a following of, 4 or 5 million at a weekend, but the circuits were filling up as well. And within about 4 or 5 years, you had 8 manufacturers coming into the British Touring Car Championship. And that's really where and how it all began. The first race we covered was 1988 at Silverstone. And it went through a few ups and downs after that. And you recommend a very good book, My Checkered Career, which has all the explanations about how we were drummed out of circuits. We lost an entire meeting once because we weren't allowed into Brands Hatch, so they cancelled the entire meeting. It got fairly lively
really?
For
so
a couple of years.
How on earth did that happen? What was that all about?
Because we had the backing of the MSA, and it was at a time when the owners of Brands Hatch were being enticed to generate their own television coverage. And Nicola Foulston, who ran Brands Hatch, her opinion was, right, if anyone's going to cover anything at our television, at our circuit, it has to be our television coverage.
Yeah, she was known as a rather feisty character, wasn't she?
Yeah. So, we'll cover it for you. We won't have Murray Walker commentating. We'll do, things our own way and blah, 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 blah. And we're not going to allow you in. So with about 5 days to go, they pulled the MSA pulled the whole meeting. And but stuff like that. Well, I ended up in the Sunday Times being accused of abusing my position in order to create the profile of the championship, which of course I was, because it was the only way you could make any progress in those days. But they were good times, and it is it is heartening now to see that that it has become a cornerstone of the British motorsport calendar. And you see 35,000 at Brands Hatch or Alton Park, an extraordinary television contract which guarantees, I think, about 70 hours of live coverage, and it's a contract that ITV have had going for over 20 years. It's one of the longest in British sports broadcasting.
2002 it started, didn't it, with recorded highlights, and then it went live full time from 2004, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I think it's only Wimbledon that's longer with one broadcaster.
Wow.
And we'll get the hang of it one day as well.
Actually, thanks for reminding me about the book again, because you'll be pleased to know I read it when it came out in 2012. But there was a story in there I remember you writing about, and I believe it was Silverstone. And I think you were doing a piece for Grandstand, and you went out onto the circuit, if I'm not mistaken, but little did you know that they'd done a second warm-up lap. It was something like that, and you said Laurent Aiello came speeding around Woodcote in the Nissan. Just tell us about that one.
Well, it was, it shows, what ignorant broadcaster I was when it came to the sort of structure of race meetings. It had rained quite heavily, and we were on the grid waiting for the cars to come around to take their places on the grid. So we positioned ourselves in front of the grid as they left the pit lane to head to the starting grid positions. But because it was raining, we didn't realise that they'd been allowed 2 preparation laps to get used to the new conditions of the circuit. And it was only when they were, I think, heading down towards Woodcote that one of the marshals ambled across and said, they're doing 2 laps. And we had tripods, we had cameras, and
wow.
And we got off in time. But we've had closer calls than that. But we shouldn't be allowed on a race circuit, really.
Just before we sign off, Steve, what were some of your personal highlights? Because there were some incredible characters, weren't there? And you had international drivers, Rydell and Menu and Radicic, Ravalia, but all the Brits there as well. And, John Cleland, for example, what an amazing character, and the contribution he made as a person as well as a driver should not be underestimated.
Oh, John was wonderful. I mean, one of the things, we brought back all the old BHP archive, and one of the tapes that I discovered in one of the camera boxes, and I'd completely forgotten about it, but it really sort of summed John up. We got him to do a lap of the Silverstone Grand Prix circuit, but strapped to the wing of a crunchy biplane, crunchy chocolate bars, and he was strapped to the top wing, and he did 2 laps and did an immaculate commentary of the lines he should take through every corner and everything, as this thing barreled at about 50 feet above the ground. And he was absolutely brilliant. So many. I mean, and my old commentary mate Tim Harvey produced a few memories as well down the years. I would pick out, though, the couple of appearances of Nigel Mansell.
Oh yes, of course.
In the Toka shootout, and we got 70,000 at Donington. When he joined the Toka shootout, I mean, he put 50,000 on the gate, and then had one of the biggest accidents I've ever seen when he stuffed it into the bridge after a nudge from Tiff Needell. But
that was huge, wasn't it, Steve? End of '93, Andy Rouse's car got destroyed, but Tiff Needell was involved in the collision as a Top Gear presenter. Nigel was the first time he'd raced in the UK as F1 World Champion and IndyCar Champion at the same time. I mean, can you imagine that happening now with Lewis Hamilton coming over to race a touring car at Donington?
I know. Yeah, but it should. I mean, it's one of my old bugbears that, if Formula One drivers want to increase their profile,
yes.
I mean, okay, Drive to Survive is one way, but get in another car in another discipline, in another environment, and challenge yourself further, and let people understand a little bit more about your driving talent. I used to love the old days when Grand Prix drivers would finish the season by driving the RAC Rally. And, Derek, Nigel did it, Derek Bell and Derek Warwick, and you learn so much more about them in those kind of situations. But anyway, so it's a bit of an old hobby also mine. But I mean, wouldn't you love to see Lewis Hamilton in the touring car championship just once? Once would be
incredible, wouldn't it? In fact, that race at the 98 race in the Mondeo, when he was Will Hoy's teammate, and that was live on Grandstand, wasn't it? And I remember it was Charlie Cox and John Watson were commentating that day. You were presenting. And that's probably my favourite ever motor race because it was touring cars, my first love. And he led the race, didn't he, Steve? He went off at Coppice in the first race, stuffed it in the barrier, and then came through. Reed spun off in front of him and hit the barrier in the Nissan. And Nigel Mansell led that race in the rain, live on BBC Grandstand. It just doesn't get much better than that, does it?
It was incredible. And I remember in Parc Fermé afterwards, you know, you get so many different reactions from drivers in Parc Fermé when they get out of their cars. And there was John Cleland, there was Nigel, there was Derek Warwick, and they just hugged each other. I mean, it was, I mean, they were virtually in tears because, you know, they all realised, you know, what they put on was not just a show, but it was, you know, one of the great races. And it had given Nigel the opportunity to really underline, you know, the breadth of his talent and how it could transfer from Formula One to just about any discipline, which you would love to see other drivers have the opportunity to do.
I remember Nigel even appeared on Noel's house party on the run-up to that Donington race to promote it. I mean, that's how big it was. It was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we will get back to those days. One of the things we're discussing at the moment is you know, generating a lot more within the touring car paddock, a lot more profile of the drivers and a lot more explanation of the personalities, and try to generate a lot of sort of in-garage material. And the plan is to do a sort of halfway equivalent of what Formula One are doing in a documentary way, and it's got the touring car version has got the working title of Drive to Collide, and we think it could work. We think it could work.
Drive to Collide. Okay, we'll watch this space then. Well, Steve, thank you ever so much. We've been talking for over an hour already, and that's flown by. We'll have to do another one if you're up for that, and we'll talk about some of the other sports you've covered and the people you've met, perhaps the nice ones and the not so nice ones. I'm sure there's been a few.
Oh, I'd love to do that, Greg. Yeah, a good golf podcast in your company would be draw out a few stories, I'm sure.
I might have to do a bit of research, but we'll give it a go.
Don't you worry, I'll just keep talking.
Okay, Steve, thanks very much. I think I am going to play the Grandstand theme in again just to sign up. Do you want to give us a closing link, Steve, to say goodbye?
I wish I could say that Grandstand will be back at the same time tomorrow, but that would be a perfect world. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of the weekend, and from myself and the whole of the Grandstand team, it's goodbye.